In the dark shadows, in the white cold, fearlessly we search for knowledge new and old. We drink the strong spirits and read the ancient tomes. The order of the Abracast. We are the brave and the bold. The Abracast. Occult, history, conspiracy, and violence.
Hey, welcome to the Abracast. I'm your host, John Towers. We're going to be... so this episode kind of got away from me a little bit during the research phase. But we're going to be talking about the Democratic National Convention 1968. And we're looking at that in preparation for what is sure to be a wild week in Chicago this week. The Democratic Convention 2024. It's a little bit of a compare and contrast kind of episode. So I do have my weapon of mass distraction mixed up and placed right here in my vessel of the art, the tincture, the Jin Jihad. So let's get this party started. We got a lot of shit to talk about tonight. Oh God. So in order to put some context into what happened, there's a lot of people talking about the similarities between 68 and 2024 as far as the Democratic National Convention is concerned. And those compare and contrasts have ramped up recently. Not just due to what people are probably rightly guessing there's going to be a lot of violence, but also the comparisons are piling up because of the LBJ stepping down and deciding not to run. I choose not to run, and what recently happened to Joe Biden. So we're going to put some of this history in context and just kind of go through. We got a couple audio clips to listen to, and some articles, as we are keeping track of and charting the the death of Western civilization. So we're starting here at Politico magazine. And this was written in 2015 by Michael Cohen. How Vietnam Haunts the Democrats. 50 years later, the ghosts of Pliaku and LBJ linger over modern politics. We've done some Vietnam episodes in the past. Probably the most recent one, and maybe the one that is most relevant, is the eternal recurrence of Joe Biden, where we talk about the completely botched and fucked up withdrawal from Afghanistan. So, let's get into it. February 7th, 1965, a company of 300 Viet Cong guerrillas armed with Kalashnikovs, mortars, and rifle grenades attacked an American helicopter base named Camp Holloway in the town of Pleiku, located in the Central Highlands of South Vietnam. The raid, which came just a few hours after the end of a week-long ceasefire for the Tet holiday, lasted only 5 minutes, but it produced the highest single number of U.S. casualties in the war. 8 Americans were killed and more than 120 wounded. Crazy, racist Lyndon President Lyndon Johnson ordered an immediate military reprisal. Within 14 hours, U.S. jets were flying bombing raids over North Vietnam. In reality, Johnson and his advisors had already made the decision to escalate U.S. involvement in the war. Ple coup simply provided the opportunity to do so. So I don't really want to get into this whole, JFK was going to de-escalate the war, before that he got assassinated. Like, that's not really what we're talking about. What we're talking about is, in the 60s leading up to this, I believe that the Vietnam War was seen as a Democrat war, not democratic war. I believe it was seen as a problem caused by Democrats, full stop, period. That's it. Nixon got in the office, and he's the one that actually started pulling the plug on all of this stuff. And, when you look at Nixon's response to the Pentagon Papers, we talked about this on an episode too. If you go back, I mean, we just have done so many episodes all linked to all this kind of stuff. One of the other, You're All Prisoners. That was another one of the good Vietnam episodes. You're all POWs now. Anyhow, when he heard about the Pentagon Papers getting leaked to the New York Times and them publishing them, he was like, who cares? Like, this is all Jack and LBJ's bullshit. Like, he thought it wasn't until the machine started spinning did it become a problem for Nixon. And if you don't know, the Pentagon Papers is just this internal study explaining what happened from the beginning of World War II to that current year in the 73, 72, 75, somewhere in that area. It's not part of my studying. It's just shit I know. So they leaked this to the New York Times. Ben Bradley, CIA asset, Ben Bradley, and the initial reaction from Nixon was like, who gives a shit? Like, this is all just lays everything at Jack's doorstep. And back to it. The decision to retaliate would, for all intents and purposes, mark the beginning of America's war in Vietnam, a conflict that would last 8 more years and take the lives of 58,000 Americans and millions more Vietnamese at home. It would create a permanent rift within the Democrat Party. In the days after the attack, while LBJ was making the push for warmonger, LBJ, one official inside his administration vocally opposed the military escalation in Vietnam. Another thing, just off the top of my head, again, is the anti-war movement in the 60s was a conservative movement. It just was. Because the Democrats started all this shit. So that makes sense, right? It wasn't until CIA and the hippies and media manipulation, culture creation, go back and listen to those episodes. Vice President Hubert Humphrey, days after Ple coup, Humphrey would submit a memo to the president that is perhaps the most persistent document on the disaster that awaited the United States in Southeast Asia. And the president at home, Johnson, ignored it. 50 years later, the events surrounding Ple coup offers an invaluable lens into not only Johnson's disastrous stewardship of the war, but also what might have been had he heeded the advice of his vice president. 2 days after the JFK assassination in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963, Johnson met with his key foreign policy advisors, where he made it clear not only would there be no change in U.S. policy in Southeast Asia, but also that he was not going to lose in Vietnam. At the time, there were 16,000 U.S. military advisors, Reed, Special Forces, Green Berets, assisting the South Vietnamese government in a war against communist insurgents, but the full nature of the American involvement in the war remained undermined over the next 14 months. However, as Johnson refused to countenance a political settlement to the conflict, the direction of U.S. policy moved in one inexorable decision towards greater and more direct military involvement. Finally, On January 27, 1965, only a week after Johnson's inauguration, National Security Advisor George Bundy, with the support of Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, submitted to Johnson the so-called "Fork in the Y" memo. The two men agreed that the U.S. the U.S. policy in Vietnam had reached a crossroads, that the continuing on the current path can lead to only disastrous defeat. The president must choose, Bundy wrote, between two alternatives: to use military power in the Far East and to force a change in communist policy, or deploy all of our resources along a track of negotiation aimed at salvaging what little can be preserved with no major addition to our present military risks. Both Bundy and McNamara favored military escalation, as did Johnson, who responded to the declaration that a stable government or no stable government will do what we ought to do. We will move strongly. The wheels were Johnson, famous, huge egotist as well. In my humble opinion, I'm not a psychologist. That's not where my doctorate is from. The wheels were set in motion. The dependents of the U.S. advisors were ordered home. Naval operations were launched off the coast of North Vietnam with the objective of baiting Hanoi into an attack. And on February 7th at Pleiku, the communists complied. The attack was hardly out of the ordinary. The Viet Cong had been hitting U.S. and South Vietnamese targets on a fairly regular basis, as Bundy, who happened to be in Vietnam at the time, would later note. Pleikus are like streetcars. Now the administration had the excuse it needed to move strongly. In a National Security Council meeting on the evening of the Pleiku attack, Johnson's aides uniformly supported retaliation, including LBJ's in-house dove, George Ball, and the Deputy Secretary of State and the administration's most prominent war skeptic. Only the lone voice spoke out against the president's preferred action. Democratic Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfeld, who was considered to be an expert on Asian affairs, argued caution would be our watchword. According to a summary memorandum of the meeting, there was no stable government in South Vietnam, said Mansfield. There had yet been another coup in Saigon just a week and a half before. He urged Johnson to consider the consequences of using force. There was, he said, the possibility of sparking a large-scale conflict with China, and there was no clarity on the position of the Soviet Soviet Union would take. The results, warned Mansfield, could be worse than Korea. Packed full of Seinfeld references today. According to meeting notes, LBJ tersely responded that he had kept the shotgun over the mantle and the bullets in the basement for a long time now, but that the enemy was killing his personnel and he could not expect them to continue their work if he did not authorize them to take steps to defend themselves. Falling back on the much abused analogy of the supposed Western appeasement of Hitler at Munich in 1938, he said cowardice has gotten us into more wars than response has, and that we would not have gotten into World War I if we had not been courageous in the early stages, nor World War II. The moment was of crucial. So here's an important thing to know about LBJ. His political hero was FDR. Yeah. The Great Society, whatever, the New Deal, it's all right there. The moment was of crucial importance. It sent a clear signal that Johnson would accept no criticism of his policies in Vietnam, even from a co-equal branch of government. Mansfield would subsequently tell the president that he would keep his doubts about the war private, which meant that as the war began to escalate, Johnson would face little pushback from the Congress. One had to be careful about expressing doubt about either the prospects of victory or the wisdom of our Vietnam policy, later wrote Chester Cooper, a member of Johnson's National Security Council. Even more worrisome, however, were Johnson's comments justifying his decision to retaliate. U.S. involvement was not necessarily about protecting South Vietnam from the communist takeover, but rather demonstrating the American resolve. The next day, Mansfield met again with Johnson and told him he believed the U.S. operations were intended to impress Ho Chi Minh. Johnson's perspective was much broader, according to the minutes of the meeting. He noted that he also intended to impress Soviet Premier Kosygin, sorry about that, and a number of others in the world, including its own citizens. The report for the president that Bundy wrote on his return to the United States after the attack, he took a similar line. There is one grave weakness in our posture in Vietnam, which is within our power to fix, and that is a widespread belief that we do not have the will and force and patience and determination to take the necessary action and to stay the course. Of course, the issue for Johnson was much bigger than how his actions would be perceived by foreign capitals. His greatest fear was that failure to contain communism in Southeast Asia would open him up to the same sort of who lost China attacks that were lodged against the Democrats in the 50s. For Johnson's strength in waging the Cold War was a political imperative and the surest way to maintain political support for his ambitious domestic agenda. It was precisely the notion of an American credibility and a determination to show no weakness or uncertainty in dealing with the North Vietnamese that would so tragically extend to the conflict. The United States was placing itself in the mercy of the enemy's will to withstand American military pressure as long as the communists kept fighting, and the U.S. was unable to defeat them militarily. Johnson would find it harder and harder to disengage from the conflict for fear of the political fallout both at home and abroad. Backing away with anything less than total surrender of the enemy became virtually impossible. But the most important decision that came out of the plea coup response was Johnson's endorsement of Bundy's recommendation of sustained reprisals. Airstrikes against North Vietnam on February 13th, LBJ authorized Operation Rolling Thunder, an aerial bombarding campaign that would begin on March 26, 1965, and continue for more than 3.5 years. Once the air war began, next came the need for ground troops to protect the airfields from which the U.S. planes took off. Less than a month after the attack, 3,500 U.S. Marines came ashore at Da Nang, the first U.S. combat troops to arrive in Vietnam, and thus beginning the cycle of escalation and fighting that would continue for 8 years. Yet the American people, who according to polling at the time strongly preferred a negotiated outcome in Vietnam to a major U.S. military commitment, there were no more the wiser. During the 1964 presidential campaign, Johnson had famously pledged not to send American boys 10,000 miles away to do what Vietnamese boys should be doing for themselves. In the wake of plea coup, Johnson continued to keep them in the dark about his plans for Vietnam. He told his aides not to discuss the reprisal attacks as though they represented a change in policy. And he disregarded advice from Bundy, who told him it was imperative that the American people understand that the prolonged fight in Vietnam would be long and arduous. And when his press aide, Bill Moyers, recommended a major presidential statement, Johnson shot him down. Indeed, a few of Johnson's inner circles were willing to throw themselves in front of the escalation train on Vietnam. Vice President Hubert Humphrey would prove to be the exception. All right, I'm losing time here. I'm going to skip down to the end. During the summer of '68, Democratic droves demanded a peace offering from the likely nominee, who was Hubert Humphrey at the time. Part of the part that I skipped over is Johnson announced that he wasn't going to run. for re-election, and we're going to get into that a little bit more depth. Humphrey stuck with the White House, even embracing the administration policies at the raucous, riot-torn party convention in Chicago. It was only at the end of September, 6 weeks before the general election, in a speech in Salt Lake City, Utah, that Humphrey finally declared independence, albeit tepidly, and called for a bombing halt in Vietnam. But it was too little, too late. After launching a furious comeback post Salt Lake City, he fell short on election day, losing to Nixon by 500,000 votes. Republicans would go on to win 4 of the next 5 presidential elections. More important, Nixon's victory would spur the GOP's political ascendancy and the birth of the conservative anti-government populism that that has become the Laguna Franca of American politics. Just as Humphrey warned in February of 1965, the war would become a minefield for Democrats. It claimed Humphrey himself as its greatest political victim. The war wrecked political coalition that had allowed the party to win 7 of the previous 9 presidential elections. To be sure, the Democratic coalition of Southerners, the urban ethnic whites, labor, blacks, liberals, it was always fragile, but the fight over civil rights, crime, and the role of government that took place in the 60s exacerbated long-standing regional, racial, and ideological divisions in the party. The fights over civil rights, crime, and the role of government that took place in the 60s exacerbated long-standing regional, racial, and ideological divisions in the party. I felt that sentence bared rereading. But Vietnam was the kill shot. An easily preventable circumstance that at a time of maximum peril for the party created division between hawks and doves that tore the party asunder. Those divisions would manifest themselves 4 years later when McGovern, running on a peace platform and with the strong support of many of the same activists who had backed McCarthy and Kennedy, won the Democratic nomination. Many in the anti-communist wing of the party, which is non-existent anymore, particularly in labor, turned its back on him, helping pave the historic landslide re-election for Nixon. For the next 2 decades, the left would hold sway within the Democratic Party. Jimmy Carter would make human rights the centerpiece of his foreign policy. The Democrats in Congress strongly opposed to the Reagan arms buildup of the 80s, the proxy wars fought in Central America, and the Gulf War. Eventually, in the 90s, the hawks would return, convinced in part that the best antidote to the McGovern-like dovishness was Republican-like hawkishness. In some respects, this foreign policy divide was never truly been bridged, and there is perhaps no wider a gap in the party than the one between the dovish Democrats' grassroots and the hawkish elite party. This was written in 2015, pretty insightful from the author. The hawkishness that has driven in some measure by the same political considerations that led Lyndon Johnson to resist de-escalation in Vietnam 50 years ago this month. As it turns out, half a century later, Democrats are still haunted by the ghosts of Pleiku.
With America's future under challenge right here at home, with our hopes and the world's hopes for peace and the balance every day, I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes or to any duties other than the awesome duties of this office. Presidency of your country. Accordingly, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president. But let men everywhere know, however, that a strong and a confident and a vigilant America stands ready tonight to seek an honorable peace and stands ready tonight to defend an honored cause, whatever the price, whatever the burden, whatever the sacrifice that duty may require. Thank you for listening. Good night, and God bless all of you.
All right. So that was the man himself, LBJ. He tacked that on to a speech he was giving, I think, from the Oval Office, and he just kind of threw it in there at the end, at the end of the speech. So now we're going to skip to. I have this in the wrong order here. Hold on, a little bit inside of baseball. The Bill of Rights Institute, Lyndon B. Johnson's decision not to run in 1968, written by Robert McMahon, Ohio State University. As 68 dawned, President Lyndon B. Baines Johnson had every expectation, notwithstanding the growing unpopularity of the Vietnam War, that he would easily receive the Democratic Party's nomination that summer to serve a second four-year term and then cruise to re-election against his Republican opponent in November. He had pushed through his ambitious legislative agenda to create the Great Society at the beginning of his term. He presided over a booming economy due to the large 1964 tax cut for business and taxpayers. What would his party say about him right now? Then he received authorization from Congress to send troops to Vietnam to fight the communism, and he was confident that the country was winning the war. Senator Eugene McCarthy, who recently announced that he would challenge Johnson for the party's nomination, but the Minnesota bid struck the president, his chief political advisors, and most observers as inconsequential and even unrealistic. Johnson's decision to run was easy because he sought to become a great president like his political hero, Franklin Roosevelt. However, the Tet Offensive, launched January 30th by America's North Vietnamese and Viet Cong enemies, and aimed at toppling the U.S.-supported Saigon regime, upset Johnson's optimistic assumptions in tragic fashion. Dramatic fashion. It was probably also tragic. It was set the stages for one of the most tumultuous presidential elections in modern history. Hold my beer. The North Vietnamese forces, regular North Vietnamese army, and the Viet Cong guerrillas failed to achieve their more ambitious goals with the Tet attacks. They were unable to rally significant popular support for the uprising they wanted in South Vietnam, and they could not hold any of the cities, towns they had targeted, and they failed to overthrow the South Vietnamese government. North Vietnam's bold gamble did succeed nonetheless, and spectacularly so, in puncturing the illusion of progress that the Johnson administration had been holding before the American public. Support for the administration's policies began to erode steadily in the wake of Tet. Before the offensive, 50% of those polled believed the United States was making progress in bringing the war to a successful conclusion. After Tet, only 33% held the view. A remarkable 49% expressed the opinion that the United States never should have intervened in Vietnam in the first place. February 8th, New York Senator Robert F. Kennedy, sworn political enemy of Johnson and an increasingly outspoken opponent of the war, offered a withering critique of the administration's policy that resonated with the glowing ranks of skeptics. Our enemy, savagely striking at will across all of South Vietnam, has finally shattered the mask of official illusion which we have concealed our true circumstances even from ourselves, he declared in a major public address. Kennedy called for an immediate negotiation aimed at a peaceful settlement, emphasizing that the United States appeared unable to defeat our enemy or break his will, at least without a huge, long, and even more costly effort. Johnson's own political party, dominant since the New Deal of the 30s, was by then profoundly split over the war. The point was driven home on March 12th when McCarthy nearly defeated Johnson in the first presidential primary in New Hampshire. Then, just 4 days later, the charismatic Kennedy announced his bid for the Democratic presidential nomination, confronting Johnson with much more formidable political foe than the introverted, less well-known McCarthy. Meanwhile, from the other end of the political spectrum, Republican contender Tricky Dick Nixon and third-party hopeful George Wallace, a former Democrat governor of Alabama, ardent segregationist and supporter of the war, were readying their challenges to the globalism and liberalism of an increasingly fractured Democratic Party. The embattled Johnson responded to mounting political pressures and those shifting political popular opinions by announcing on March 31st, a major shift in U.S. policy in the Vietnam War. In an address to the nationwide television audience, President said he was ceasing nearly all bombing raids against North Vietnam, and he called on Hanoi to enter formal negotiations with the United States to secure a peace settlement. Just before the close of his address, Johnson shocked his listeners by declaring that he would neither seek nor accept this party's presidential nominations. We just heard this. Johnson's decision was not easy because it was driven by the deep political ambition that he was greatly troubled by the divisions and the turbulence in American society and by an increasingly unpopular war that he was so closely tied to. Formal peace talks opened in Paris in '68, but the unrest in the United States enormously complicated. I think that's all that we're going to get into. Let me just check the end here. The election of 1968 proved pivotal in the course of modern American history in numerous respects. It deconstructed the efficacy of the backlash tactics pioneered by Nixon and Wallace to highlight and to condemn the perceived excesses of liberal permissiveness and the welfare state and the anti-war movement and the counterculture. And it also brought to the White House a chief executive dedicated to extraditing the U.S. from the chaos of Vietnam, but to do so slowly and deliberately without compromising the credibility of the U.S. Commitments, without dismissing America's commanding status as a global superpower, and without threatening his plans for dealing with China and the Soviet Union. In political terms, it heralded the high water mark of the New Deal order and the onset of the new Republican ascendancy. So imagine if we would have just took deliberate, thought through steps in withdrawing from Afghanistan instead of just going like, hey, bitch, bye. You know what I'm saying?
Of the Youth International Party, Yippies they called themselves, converged on Chicago. They said they were there to protest the war, poverty, racism, and other social ills. Some of them were also determined to provoke a confrontation, to draw attention from the convention to the streets. Mayor Richard Daley vowed to keep it peaceful, even if it took force to keep the peace. He was backed by 12,000 police, 5,000 National Guardsmen, 7,500 regular Army troops. Hundreds of marchers and dozens of policemen were injured. Restraint was absent on both sides. This was later called a police riot. During that frightful week, the demonstrators repeatedly tried to march on the site of the convention, the stockyards. Repeatedly, they were forced back. But even inside the convention hall, the virus of violence was pervasive. Dan Rather and Walter Cronkite of CBS News.
Take your hands off of me. Unless you intend to arrest me, don't push me, please.
Couldn't happen to a nicer person, by the way. Dan Rather, thank you. All right. Sorry for stepping on that audio presentation. That was actually from HistoryChannel.com. We're about to get into a lot greater depth on what actually happened. This is from ABC Eyewitness News 7, the Chicago ABC affiliate. So this is Disney, so whatever. Take it with a grain of salt. This was written in August of 2018, and it's called The Days of Rage, the timeline of the 1968 Democratic National Convention. The 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago has become one of the most emblematic events of the decade, a culmination of years of hope and idealism that spiraled into days of rage, causing wounds to the party and the country that some scholars perceive persist to this day. Divisions within the Democrat Party over the war in Vietnam were on display inside the convention hall. Outside, in the streets and the parks of Chicago, anti-war demonstrators were met with violence from the Chicago Police Department and the Army National Guard under the direction of then Mayor Richard Daley. President Lyndon Baines Johnson announced in March of '68 that he would not be running for re-election. A broad array of politicians and organizers saw the opportunity to influence the course of the war. Some, including Vice President Hubert Humphrey, supported the war. Others, like Senator Eugene McCarthy and the young political organizers of the New Left, were strongly against the war and wanted to adopt an official plank opposing it. The Youth International Party, or Yippies, Students for Democratic Society, read Communists, and other New Left, read Communist organizers applied for permits to hold protests in the city parks during the convention. Daley delayed granting any permits, leaving organizers in limbo and allowing frustrations to mount. Fed up with waiting, organizers decided their voice would be heard with or without permission. August 23rd, 1968, 3 days before, so this would have been Friday. 3 days before the official start of the DNC, the Youth International Party holds their own candidate nomination at Chicago Civic Center, now called Daley Plaza. Daley Plaza. Not to be confused with Dealey Plaza. There is a large police presence as the Yippies nominate their own candidate for president, a pig named Pegasus. 7 people are arrested along with Pegasus. August 24th, 1968, delegates begin to arrive in Chicago at Lincoln Park. Protesters hold drills as they prepare for their demonstrations. Mayor Daley deployed the National Guard, the New York Times reports. He also implements an 11 p.m. curfew for the park on that day, and protesters obey the curfew. August 25th, 1968. The Yippies begin their Festival of Life in Lincoln Park. There were about 2,000 attendees, according to newspaper reports at the time. Police sweep the park at 11 p.m. and beat demonstrators who don't leave, punishing them out of the park and into the Old Town neighborhood. In the wake of the night's unrest, the New York Times reports that the National Guard has once again been given the, quote, shoot to kill, unquote, orders if protesters do not obey them or if they see looting. I mean, that statement is fucking wild. The first thing it reminds me of is that video that's been making the rounds during the COVID lockdowns in Minnesota with, when Tim Walz was governor. And it's like a squad of cops in body armor just opening fire with paintball guns at people who won't get out go off their porch and into their house because of COVID. It's shocking. It's a shocking video. And you could say, yeah, they were just fucking paintballs, but I mean, just what? I mean, it's fucking crazy. I don't even know if they were paintballs. They might have been milsims or something. I don't know what it was, but the guns didn't have hoppers, because originally I was like, holy shit, they're opening fire. And then, so everyone runs in the house, and I think it was a female that got hit, was like, they shot me like right in my crotch, and there's like a big green paint mark, like, you know where, you know what I'm talking about. Are we going to see more of that? Are we going to see that this week? That'd be fun. August, back to it. Sorry for blabbing. I'm so far behind. August 26, 1968, Mayor Daley officially opens the 1968 Democratic National Convention at the International Amphitheater, which closed in 1999, on the south side of Chicago near the Union Stockyards. Thousands protest the start of the convention in the South Loop in Grant Park. The Festival of Life continues in Lincoln Park. Inside the convention, tensions in the party become obvious as delegates argue long into the night. Outside in Lincoln Park, the police wind up using tear gas. To clear protesters at 11 p.m., demonstrators are reported covering the protests. Demonstrators and reporters covering the protests are beaten by Chicago cops. August 27, 1968. Protests continue in multiple locations. In Grant Park, the protesters are largely peaceful. They're only burning Minnesota down, but they're largely peaceful. In Lincoln Park, they are violent. Tensions continue to rise inside the convention. Dan Rather, who is a awful human being, then a reporter for CBS, is roughed up by security as he attempts to intervene or interview a delegate who's being escorted out of the hall. The incident is broadcast live on television. Couldn't happen to a nicer guy, Dan Rather. August 28th, 1968. The only permit issued by Mayor Daley for a protest is for August 28th. Approximately 15,000 people attend the demonstration in Grant Park. Chicago cops form a human barricade around the protest and prevent demonstrators from marching to the convention. As a result, protesters end up on Michigan Avenue and outside the Conrad Hilton Hotel. Police and National Guardsmen beat protesters and some reporters despite the large media presence. A strike by the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers prevent the scene from being broadcast. How convenient. But the television networks shuttle the footage to the hubs at their convention hall, from which the shocking images are then broadcast. The riots become known as the Battle of Michigan Avenue. Hundreds are injured and hundreds more arrested. August 29th, 1968. Inside the convention hall, Vice President Hubert Humphrey accepts his party's nomination for President of the United States. Outside, hundreds of protesters try to march into the International Amphitheater, and they were stopped with tear gas and more violence from the cops. The convention officially ends. Chicago police said a total of 589 people were arrested and 119 police officers and 100 protesters were injured. The Medical Committee for Human Rights said more than 1,000 people, including protesters and members of the press, were injured and treated during the Democratic National Convention. The events of and around the 1968 DNC exposed a deep rift in the Democratic Party and the New Left. Read Communist. Many organizers of the New Left would point to the DNC as the moment the movement started to fall apart, especially as it failed to affect the party's nomination in November. Humphrey narrowly lost the election to Richard Nixon. On December 1st, a panel led by Dan Walker released its findings on violence surrounding the DNC in a report called Rights in Conflict, the Walker Report. The nature of the response was unrestrained and indiscriminate. Police violence on many occasions, particularly at night. The Walker Report stated the violence was made all the more shocking by the fact that it was often inflicted upon persons who had broken no law, disobeyed no order, made no threat. These included peaceful demonstrators, onlookers, and large numbers of residents who were simply passing through or happened to live in the areas where the confrontations were occurring. Well, I mean, you take that at face value, right? And also consider the source of what is in the spins that were unleashed. In response to an article in the Los Angeles Times in 1996, Walker himself wrote in the paper to clarify his meaning. What I wrote in the personal summary of the over 300-page fact-filled documentation of the tragic events in this, a majority of Chicago police acted responsibly, a minority engaged in violence and can only be termed a police riot. Walker's letter reads, no one reads objectively the facts detailed in Rights in Conflict could reach any other conclusion regarding that a minority of the police on duty. Those facts were taken from many hours of movies, thousands of still pictures, and thousands of eyewitnesses' accounts, including those contained in over 1,000 FBI statements taken from participants. So I've survived something like a riot. And I can tell you that it is a terrifying situation. I mean, wildly terrifying. I believe that I defied death that day. And as a counterpoint to that, or not as a counterpoint, but as to expound a little bit, I've worked with cops for a long time. I'm not saying that I was a cop, not a cop, but I was in a situation, I was a security professional, and I was in many multiple hundreds of situations where working directly with police officers, and I know that they are not infallible. I know that they are actually quite fearful people sometimes. Many times there's something about I believe it's something about their lack of training that makes them fearful. I know that a lot of cops, not all cops, I know a lot of cops, probably most cops, lie. I know they can lie right to your face. I'm not saying legally, I'm saying like ethically and morally. They can look right into your eyes and tell you things that are not true. And so, you know, I can believe that these guys were scared shitless, so they lashed out at the crowd. I believe that. And I also believe that, quote, protesters, unquote, protesters, you know, I mean, just look at videos of protests. I think that a lot of them go there and they want to get beat up. They want to relive this fucking thing. This thing is like anti-war riots and stuff and protests in the 60s and 70s are like and also like, we mentioned like the Pentagon Papers, like Watergate, and that there's something about that slice of time. It was like the leftist, like golden age. There's something about it where leftists today want to reenact that. Like every leftist reporter really wants to be Woodward and Bernstein, CIA assets. Every person that shows up at like a stupid BLM protest or whatever, like they really want to like be, hip, like have a hippie vibe from the 60s or something. Like it's just something that you could see. If you're looking at it, you could see it. Like I mentioned, I threw some of my cop buddies like under the bus just then, but I'm being truthful with you. And the riot situation that I was in was, I don't even want to tell you where it was at. I'm so embarrassed. All right, I'll come clean. It was at an Ozfest, okay? It was at an Ozfest, and my dirty white ass was in danger. I could have died. Fred Durst almost killed me. I can tell you the whole story. If I hadn't already. I might have even told you that. I don't know. NPR, 1968 Democratic National Convention, a week of hate. More than 50 years ago, the Democratic Party's National Convention in 1968 continued to haunt the party and cast shadows over U.S. politics, writes James Jeffrey. The signs before the Democratic National Convention convened in Chicago from August 26th to 29th in 1968, they were never good. Anti-war protesters began arriving in the city a week before, vowing to change the party's policy towards the increasingly hated Vietnam War. They included New Left radicals, long-haired hippies, so-called yippies, members of the Youth International Party, a radical youth-oriented counterculture offshoot of the 60s free speech and anti-war movements fomenting against the U.S. government. Some were bent on disrupting the convention by whatever means necessary, while others focused on more left-field tactics, such as holding counterculture convention, offering the likes of a nude grope-in for peace and prosperity, and workshops on joint rolling, guerrilla theater, and draft dodging. Rumors were floated by some of the more imaginative protesters that they were going to insert LSD into the city's drinking water and send out stud teams to seduce the wives and daughters of the delegates, all designed to unnerve the Democrat delegates and to keep the Chicago police and investigative agencies guessing. The city's tough-talking mayor, Richard Daley, wasn't taking any chances. He mobilized. Okay, we just did that. Not all protesters are angry. They have a point to make, but these protests regarded the police as pigs, who in turn regarded them as draft-dodging hippies, says a journalist, Dennis Brack, who covered the convention. The International Amphitheater hosting the convention was encircled by barbed wire and a long, high chain-link fence, while at 11 p.m. curfew was imposed across the city. It was worse than expected by the city's authorities, and before the convention was over, it had happened. A chaotic, bloody shambles from which the Democratic Party never fully recovered, changing and influencing the American political landscape up into this day. This picture is fucking wild, man. This is BBC World US Canada News. Again, it's called the 1968 Democratic National Convention, a week of hate. This picture that's in this part of the article is amazing. It's a army guy. He's dressed in an army uniform. He's got a helmet on. He's got an M1 with a bayonet affixed to it, and he's over the ground. There's these two dudes I think one's a black guy for sure, and he's just bleeding from his neck. And there's a guy laying next to him in the street with bloody boot prints stuck all over his back. Like, this picture is amazing. How did this never get used as the cover of a punk rock album, bro? Or like a wow wow waka waka wow wow. Come with it now. This is tailor made. It might even be fake. It's so good. It was the most intense week of hate I've ever experienced, Mr. Brack said in an oral history interview given by the Donald Briscoe Center for American History in Austin, Texas, which houses Brack's archives. Combat heat is different. This was a plain old one group hating another, and it always stayed closer to the older cops. They were safer, but the younger cops could really hurt you. As delegates checked into the Conrad Hilton Hotel in the convention center, organizers of the protest were placed under electronic and direct personal surveillance, roadblocks barred avenues of sentries, jeeps, and barbed wire on their bumpers took armed troops to expected trouble spots. It was a city under siege. It was this sort of thing that you would find in a third world city. Some would argue that 2024 Chicago is a third world city, says Stephen Shames, who attempted the convention both as a journalist for the Underground Press and a protester. America was on the edge. The decade appeared ensnared in unending violence, both abroad and at home in Detroit, had been torn apart during the long, hot summer of '67 by violent and bloody confrontations between blacks and police. Riots had broken out at the Capitol, Washington earlier in 1968 following the April assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, which was followed in June by the assassination of Bobby Kennedy. We'd be covering confrontations and riots for 2 to 3 years, Mr. Brack says. All the journalists had their own riot gear. It was expected to happen back then. It was just another day at the office. By Sunday, 25 August, the day before the convention started, the city's Lincoln Park had been taken over by anti-war demonstrators waving banners and shouting obscenities about President Lyndon Johnson and chanting, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids have you killed today?" That night, about 1,000 demonstrators defied curfew, resulting in an estimated 500 police wading into the park and waving truncheons. Their predominantly young prey fled or turned and hurled rocks, bottles, and profanities at the officers, as reported, and the cameramen captured the scene. Jules Whitcover, a journalist covering the convention, later wrote in his book, "The Year the Dream Died, Revisiting 1968 in America." So I think we get I'll do this part, and then I think we get the picture. The animosity found its way to the International Amphitheater when the convention started the next day. Heated arguments and even scuffles broke out of the convention during a convoluted mess over what policy to take on Vietnam and who should be the Democratic nomination to run for president. Everything ran over schedule. Come Tuesday night, even more protesters in Lincoln Park refused to observe the 11 o'clock curfew. Police poured tear gas into the park, eventually driving out about 3,000, mostly young protesters, arresting 140 of them. Police bust out of the woods in selective pursuit of new photographers. Nicholas von Hoffman wrote in the Washington Post, "Pictures are unanswerable evidence in court." They'd taken off their badges and their nameplates, even the unit patches of their shoulders, to become a mob of unidentifiable club swingers. God, I have a great story about this. Sorry about that. I have a great story about cops removing their identification to deal with rioters, but I cannot tell you. I just can't tell you. and it's killing me. All right, let's wrap this fucker up. So what is the Democratic National Convention in 2024? The presidential nominating convention in which delegates to the U.S. United States Democratic Party will vote on the party platform and ceremoniously report their vote to the nominee, Vice President Harris. I don't remember which way to say her name, so I'm not going to... People are getting called racist over that shit, so I'm not going to touch... I don't remember. And to affirm her choice of government, Tim Walz of Minnesota for vice president. The 2024 presidential election is scheduled to be held August 19th to August 22nd, 2024 at the United Center in Chicago, Illinois. Delegates nominated Harris for president through online and phone voting at the what? That lasted from August 1st to August 5th. Harris is the first black woman and the first South Asian person to be the presidential nominee of a major political party in the United States, the first Democratic presidential nominee from the Western United States. What? All right, we're just going to skip to the most relevant part of this Wikipedia article. Security. $50 million in federal funding will be $50 million in federal funding will be provided for security spending. As a major party presidential nominating convention in 2024, Democratic National Convention will be designated a national special security event and will be the second such event to be held in Chicago to receive this designation, with the first having been the 2012 NATO summit. By June 2023, the United States Secret Service had begun collaborating, okay, we'll see how that works out, on preserving for the preparations for the convention, with the Chicago Police Department and other police departments will be involved in the convention. Is anyone else just curious to see what the Secret Service is going to fuck up? It was like, obviously, the Trump attempted assassination thing, and then last week, like, Secret Service broke into some place so they can use the toilet and eat all the free mints on the desk. That was in Atlanta. What is that? What are they going to do this week? We'll see. I should make up a bingo card on what they're going to do. Protests and demonstrations related to the U.S. Government support for Israel and their ongoing invasion of Gaza are expected to emerge while the convention is being held. In preparation for the event, party leaders demonstrated confidence in Chicago police and federal officials to manage protesters using such methods as drawing set parameters for demonstrations to take place, as well as initiating mass arrests in cases such as these regulations being violated. As of April 2024, organizers expect as many as 30,000 protesters in Chicago during the convention. Commentators have drawn comparisons between upcoming convention and the 1968 convention, which we just talked about at some length. Also held in Chicago, in which protests opposed to the Vietnam War turned violent when the city used extreme levels of police brutality to suppress the protesters. May 2024, Politico reported that party leaders were considering limiting in-person gatherings at the United Center to primetime sessions, only to reduce the possibility of disruption, which would include holding official business to McCormick Place. What's the rest of this? And possibly of the formal certification taking place before the convention due to conflicts with deadline requirements in Ohio, and retaining elements of 2020's convention, including a focus on pre-recorded segments such as the virtual roll call. We all remember that one. You know, the light in the light of the assassination attempt on Orange Man on July 13th, the Secret Service will secure the United Center and the immediate area surrounding it. And the Chicago Police Department will secure everything outside in the inner perimeter, with both agencies securing rooftops of all buildings that they may have a line of sight to the United Center. On Monday, August 12th, the first round of parking restrictions took place in an effort for the DNC in Chicago. Some residents, such as people at a senior living apartment complex near major Democratic National Convention sites in Chicago, are confused and frustrated with the no parking zone restrictions outside and the Chicago DNC perimeter. They say no parking signs have started appearing in their streets, even though they are outside the convention's car-free zones. These restrictions found it an unwelcome surprise to lose the street parking for which they claim is now interfering with their day-to-day lives. Yeah, imagine not being able to park. Like, how is that not going to agitate your life? Interfere with your life. So organizations such as Samadoun, I'm unfamiliar with that one, and it's not blue, so I can't click on it to learn more. Code Pink, the Answer Coalition, and several others are planned to demonstrate and generate publicity. I believe the story that we're going to be talking about this week is going to be what the several others are. I'm John Towers. This has been the Abracast. See you next week as we track the death of Western civilization here for all time. On an internet the government's going to control next week. I don't know. So we live in weird times, bro. Oh God, I gotta start this.
Are you interested in the occult, history, conspiracy, and violence? Learn more at Abracast.com and visit the storefront for tarot cards, merch, and books. Support the show. Get access to the show archive at subscribestar.com. Thank you for listening to this episode. Send an email or visit us on social media to let us know what you think about this topic. And please remember to leave a 5-star rate and review.